podcast headed by me that is all about how to make your life better. So we're going to talk to Kate about her podcast and about how to make our lives better, especially during the pandemic. But while I'm waiting for Kate to join, tell us, where in the world are you watching from? And speaking of podcasts, is there a podcast that you love that you want to suggest that everybody else listen to, because there is nothing more exciting than finding a new podcast to listen to. So put it in so that everybody can join. And let's get Kate. I think she's, oh yeah, Phoenix. Oh, this is so fun to see where people are joining from. We love you, Kate. And someone said, we love you, Kate.
Hello.
Hey,
welcome to my Canadian propaganda zone. That's where I live, apparently.
Okay, great. Excellent. Well, thanks so much for coming today.
Oh, I'm so glad to be with you.
So I'm like gonna always have to adjust myself here a little bit. So your podcast is so great. Everything happens. And for people who haven't listened to it yet, how did you get the idea for it, and how has it been having it?
Yeah. Well, it came out of the very sad memoir I wrote called Everything Happens for a Reason and Other Lies I've Loved, as I was trying to make sense of a life suddenly upended by stage 4 cancer. And for some reason, so writing the book felt like it was for me, but having a podcast felt like, it felt important to change, I think, the narrative we have about suffering people, where if someone does like a good job at suffering, they're like the scrappy one and the special one, and everyone else just gets to stew in their feelings of like frustration and fear and uncertainty. And I was like, you know what? I think starting a podcast to have these hard conversations about how suffering makes us feel like failures in a culture that doesn't always understand how to allow there to be like more than one definition of how to live your best life now. So right. That ended up just being the place to kind of try to create more language and create a little more community about what it feels like when your life comes apart.
Well, it's interesting because I'm a huge fan of Dani Shapiro's podcast, Family Secrets, which came out of her memoir, Inheritance, which was about learning that the father who raised her wasn't her biological father. And she talked about how starting to hear, when she told her story, she started to hear other people's stories. And then she started feeling like we need to share these stories, because that's how we can really, like, for her, it's all about getting rid of the shame around secrets. And for you, I think it's around like the feeling that we can't own our suffering. And it's interesting to me that you, because you really did come from that, I can do anything. Let me make my to-do list. I've got it on the calendar. I've got this. I mean, so you went through that as like,
I did. I was going to be like the best cancer patient ever. I was gonna, like, even when I told myself like I'm a very sophisticated person, no one wins at cancer. Like there's no such thing as like good suffering. But I think it's just like the performative optimism of being raised in a certain tradition and like being female in a way that people expect. I just found that like I was so cheerful about my problems that I really wasn't being honest anymore. And I was really struggling for like more language about how to say like, my life, it no longer has the landmarks it once did. How am I supposed to make my way forward when I can't go back to that person that I used to be?
Yeah. Well, I want to tell you, somebody says, my husband has stage 4 cancer, and your book really spoke to me. So that's really lovely to hear that, that it, so somebody going through a similar thing.
Yeah.
And then as you've interviewed all these people, were you, I mean, I'm sure there were certain threads that you were kind of looking to bring out. But then were there things that surprised you? Oh, and if you're just joining, I'm Gretchen Rubin of the Happier with Gretchen Rubin podcast. And this is Kate Bowler of the Everything Happens podcast, also the memoir, Everything Happens for a Reason and Other Lies I've Loved. So Kate, like, did you sort of think, what's that? I was not expecting to see that.
Yeah, we're all lonely, apparently. It feels, I think there's something so isolating about pain that when you go through something hard, or maybe you're in like a profession that requires you to like emotionally invest all the time, it does kind of make you feel like you're on one side of plexiglass, and like there must be happy people out there and they're eating artisanal salads and we're so happy for them, but like I can't get back there. And so loneliness ended up being a big theme. Lacking the feeling constantly explained. Almost everyone I talked to feels isolated because they're considered like a problem to be solved. So if you're sick, then all of a sudden everyone wants to know, like, yeah, but was it genetic, or was it something you ate? Like, everyone's trying to decide if it's your fault so that they can race back to feeling safe again. And so the like constant desire to be explained
Right.
is that made people feel like they no longer own their own stories, that they were just like, I used to be a cool and normal person, and now I'm either like a tragedy, or the person someone mentions at a party when they're like, oh, did you hear about? Like, oh, well, I guess they did.
Well, I wonder if it's kind of like, there's people often remark that when one couple in a group of friends gets divorced, it kind of makes everybody reevaluate their own relationship and like the decisions they've made, and that can sometimes be very threatening and destabilizing to people. And again, it's like, we all know that bad things can happen for kind of no good reason, but when we see it happen to somebody that we know, it reminds us of kind of the arbitrariness of fate at times. And that can feel like,
Yes.
very unsettling, because we want to
Yeah.
feel like, as long as I, wear my seatbelt and don't smoke, like, this is going to be fine.
Totally. Yeah, everyone wants to like wear their seatbelt and consider not smoking. You're totally right. But like, uncertainty is the worst. Like we've been talking about, like, uncertainty blows on every level. And like I don't know. I started to just kind of wonder if, and like, what messages do we need to hear in those times of uncertainty? Like, sometimes for people who have all kinds of resources, they just need permission to like, it's okay in the middle of pandemic world, for example, to like take a nap or take it down a notch. Or for people who are stuck and find themselves unable to act, those people actually need a language of a little more like, you can do it. like today's your day to get out there. And so helping people kind of locate themselves on that sliding scale of what they feel able to do, and then giving them a little community and like support around that has kind of been one of the big arcs of the podcast. Is everyone kind of comes in at a very different place with resources, and then we're all just trying to figure out like, how can we do the most with what we have.
Yeah, somebody says uncertainty blows on every level equals the world's anthem. So I think your next t-shirt merch opportunity there, Kate. But what's kind of funny, and I never thought about this until you said it, is like, maybe in everyday life we never question the fact that people are in wildly different places and having wildly different circumstances, and some are better and some are worse. And there goes my phone, please ignore it. But now, since we're all sort of kind of in the same situation, we're maybe more surprised, or like we expect ourselves to sort of match other people's situation, whereas there's so many considerations and factors that change it.
Yeah, and I think one of the factors that we forget when we're like a little more durable, like we maybe all have a season in our lives where we like kind of have it together for a hot minute. We're like, I'm really doing it. Like, I can pull off a blazer. Then they're just like, you're like moving through an airport and there's nothing stuck on your wheel behind you, and you're like, this is it. Right. And then there's the rest of life where you're caring for someone who's dependent on you with little kids, or an elderly parent, or you just have a career that in this gig economy is like sucking the life out of you. And it's all those moments when you realize, oh my gosh, I'm so much more fragile than I realized. And I need like a little more compassion and a little more permission to live into those parts of my life, instead of always imagining I'm just about to skip it and get back to regular scheduled programming.
Right. Well, if you're just joining, I'm Gretchen Rubin of the Happier with Gretchen Rubin podcast. This is Kate Bowler of the Everything Happens podcast. We're sort of talking about like, how do we make ourselves happier in a time that's even more challenging than just everyday life. Oh, someone says, I loved your book. Our whole book club loved it. Oh, that's really lovely to hear. It would be a great book for a book club. I know a lot of book clubs like to read fiction, but I think this is it's pretty short. And I think people, if I may say so, Kate, I think you might think, oh, reading about like a young mother who has stage 4 cancer might be really upsetting, and you feel like you maybe don't want to read it. But I think, Kate, you really managed to have a book where it's really a very profound and thought-provoking book, but I don't think it's the kind of book that people would find like overwhelming, as some memoirs can be. And it's really, really thought-provoking. Someone says, I love this. I need this right now. Well, okay, but Kate, here's the thing. I feel like one of the issues with self-compassion and bringing it down a notch and stuff is that for some people, it can take them to a negative place.
Yes,
And it
yes.
can become kind of the loophole. Like, you don't want to do something to make yourself feel better that in the end just ends up making you feel worse. And the fact is, everything that we do has consequences. And I think it's really, I completely agree. Have compassion, be realistic with ourselves. This is like, we've never done a pandemic before, but it's also real, in that it's not like an imaginary alternate universe. Because sometimes I feel like I'm going to wake up and everything will have zipped back to like March 13th, which was the day when my life changed. And I sort of feel like this is all just like kind of a thought experiment, but it's not.
No.
So how do you hold those two things in your mind? Have compassion, but also remember this is real.
Yeah. And like, I think it's really painful to acknowledge in a moment like now that all of a sudden we're so much more aware that we're living inside a finite economy, right? Like in terms of what we can do for ourselves, how like the kinds of resources we even have to make ourselves happy, or to reach out, or to feel loved, or to have enough money, and like all the things, right? Like all the things that make us feel full up and kind of safe. Those have thinned. And so you're right.
Even just dropping by a friend's house or going out for a walk together or something. Yeah, we've lost that. Yeah.
It's like even the illusion of extra is gone. And that's a tricky mental and spiritual, I think, place to live, is because if you're like me and you like set your life up like a little independence project, like where it's just like, this is about me and what I can do. And like, then like when that stuff thins out, it can be really terrifying because we can feel ourselves closer and closer to the edge. And so there's, I think, two reactions. One is to kind of kick back to hyper agency, like, okay, I'll manage the day like this. And the other is to, I'm hoping, like, try to figure out what part of our independence narrative we might want to question. Like, maybe there were actually parts where, like, I wasn't supposed to be by myself. I was already fragile and I needed that interdependence. Like, I need that leaning into other people and the way they can reflect back to us, like, that truth of who we really are and need to be. So yes, thinning resources is scary, but like, it does call into question stuff that, like, stories that don't serve us well. And one is that we're supposed to be do it alone projects. And like, I'm just 90% sure we're not.
I'm remembering one of my favorite parts of your book where, so you're a professor at Duke Divinity School, and you sort of talk about how like everybody at school had just decided, like, okay, people, we got our project right now. Kate Bowler, get on it, get in the line, like, we're doing this. And I thought, I wanted like the 3-hour documentary of that coming together. And I'm sure in a way it was probably a lot to handle, and also very beautiful and like complicated.
I know. Yeah. Like, I hate being needy. It sucks. Yeah. Like, I should be honest. Like, I've hated it. Like, I have hated being interdependent. I openly rail against my fragility, and if I could choose being alone,
I love that. I openly what was it? I openly
rail against my fragility. I think. Yeah. Like, I really hate it.
The t-shirts just keep coming, Kate. You're on a roll today.
I resent my weakness. I am the last person to take naps. I want like the dignity of doing everything by myself. And like, I remember that moment so vividly when I was so sick, and the hospital was basically attached to my place of employment. So I didn't even get to choose who got to see me in the mostly naked hospital gown and like on drugs, railing about who or what I may have done in my teenage years. Like, there's no dignity anymore. And as much as I hated that, and I really did, I did have the feeling that like, we are actually, like, when we're taken apart, we really can be remade in some weird way by the love of other people. And like, I in the last, like, since pandemic world started, like, I get a lot of mail, and like some of the most inspirational mail I get is people taking on other people as their group project. They'll be like, okay, you've just lost your job and your ailing mother is stuck in a care home without adequate resources, and they just like, they figure out all the weird and creative ways to rally. That that is some of the most inspiring stuff I get to witness. I'm like, man, witness is a powerful thing right now when we think we're all alone, and then we just see like, oh, all the web surrounding each other.
Well, so Elizabeth and I did an interview with, so I'm Gretchen Rubin of the Happier with Gretchen Rubin podcast. This is Kate Butler of the Everything Happened podcast. And Elizabeth and I interviewed Kate, and that interview will go live tomorrow. But I loved your phrase in that interview, Kate, where you talked about absurd creativity, to connect now. We can't rely on all the things that we usually do. So people are just like really happy to like use their imagination, and there's an absurdity to it, but it's also it's very beautiful. We're so excited because the podcast Everything Happens is going to join the family of the Better podcast for the Onward Project, which are all about making your life better. So that's Side Hustle School, Happier in Hollywood, which is Elizabeth's other podcast, and Do the Thing with Melissa Urban. And Kate, it's just so exciting to have. I've been a fan of yours for so long. Someone said, I loved your book, so well written and true, and the title is perfect. Thank you. Someone else said that they stopped saying everything happens for a reason. Thanks for your book. Yeah. Someone says, love your podcast, Kate. Yeah. Your podcast has helped me so much, Kate. Yeah. I think a lot of your existing fans are watching. And it is, I think, Kate, the reason that I love your podcast is I think you can get to a very deep and even dark place, but with kind of a light spirit. And sometimes I feel like it's hard to open ourselves up to pain. I mean, you talk about this all the time because we have that self-protection, and that's important sometimes, but I feel like you're able to get there in a way that it's like, I don't need to like pick my time like to the minute to make sure that I have the emotional wherewithal to handle it, like some things are just they're hard to take,
they are. And sometimes it's a little easier sometimes when we teach each other, like when we have another story of someone else who went to that hard place, who like my friend Nora McInerney, she has this great she's just like such an inspiration to me. And when she says like, oh, when I get bad news, it's like, I have to walk the plank, and then if it goes well, then I'm like suddenly back on the plank. Like, what a wonderful image that helps me feel like it's not quite so scary to always have to walk the plank. So I do find like, if it is, I hope a little bit like a muscle that we can like build and build so we get stronger at loving each other. And I'm hoping eventually that will eventually change our cultural stories about whether or not it is culturally permissible to have your life fall apart without feeling like a cultural loser.
Right. Well, if you have questions for Kate, put them in the comments. But here's a very thought-provoking question. Someone says, how do we elevate those stories of grace while honoring the immense pain experienced by so many? This is really, I often hear the question, is it morally appropriate to seek to be happier in a world so full of suffering? So what would you say to that question?
Oh man, Gretchen, but now I want the answer to your question. I hear you. So do you mind telling me fast, what do you always say to that?
That it's a false choice, and that actually happy people are more interested in the problems of the world. They're more interested in the problems of other people, and they are more able to help. And so it's the whole put on your oxygen mask first, and that your own happiness doesn't detract from it, but actually strengthens you to help others. So if it is selfish to be happier, you should be selfish, if only for selfless reasons. So that's my nutshell answer. So what would you say about how do we elevate stories of grace while honoring the pain?
Yeah, I think because honoring the pain sounds like, for instance, we all just went through Mother's Day, and like that's a great little case in point of like wanting to, for instance, lift up the stories of incredible, beautiful, like gorgeous, resilient moms, and acknowledging a world of people who wanted to be moms, lost babies, lost children, are living through that death of possible futures that happens when that life slipped away. I think part of I think similarly to what you're saying about happiness is it's important to like enter into anyone else's story in a spirit of non-competitive pain. That like,
ooh, what's non-competitive pain?
Well, like because I think we all feel apologetic if our stuff doesn't count as much as other people's, which means then that we are sometimes almost withholding our own gifts because we feel the lessons that we've learned or the graces we've been given because we worry it doesn't match up to others. And I think that's a kind of limited economy model that deprives us all. That if we do it with a spirit of like love and togetherness, like no one person's surprising lesson they learned or gift they found in the dark is going to diminish the fact that somebody else has not yet found it or is still looking for it or is living with less than enough. So I do always like to say, like, if you don't have enough right now, like, there's nothing wrong with you. It's because it's awful. Like, it's
Right.
good to just say that first without saying, like, oh, and like, here's how we like turn it around. It doesn't have to just be
Right.
silver linings
Right.
or bottomless pit, you know?
Well, that's a big theme in your book and in the podcast, which is that we do have these narratives, which is everything happens for a reason, or you'll learn this. I'm a huge fan of Game of Thrones, and I realized, like, on rewatching it, that a huge theme of Game of Thrones is everything that you have done, even the worst things you have done, is what brought you here today, which is to play the role that you are meant to play. So it's sort of like, and this is like people who get divorced and they say, I am divorced now, but I'm glad I got married because now I have my beautiful children, and I would never have, I don't want to undo that.
Yeah.
And yet I do think sometimes people want to hit you over the head with this and be like,
oh, totally.
no,
Everything's amounting to
something.
something.
What did you call it? The learning? Wait, you had a funny phrase for this. When people like really want you to get the message of your own pain. What was that? You have some funny phrase.
Oh, tyranny of prescriptive something like that. They're always like, and everyone's trying to make me learn a lesson. I do, yes. And I have this like deep hatred of when people weaponize the idea that nothing is lost. Like,
oh,
that is bananas. It is absolute insanity to say that nothing is lost or everything has to amount to something. It's completely untrue. People who lose children, adult children, to suicide could never possibly listen to someone else say that nothing was lost. Like, we lose things all the time. And if we're forced to not be honest about what we've lost, we can't take stock.
Yes.
We can't figure out our resources. We don't know how to move forward because we're constantly being lied to by, like, I think people try to just pad it for us to be like, oh, don't worry. It's all making you the person you are today.
Yes. Yeah.
Wow.
It feels very
I'll tell you, I picked the person I was before because I miss not having cancer. I'm pretty sure I do.
Well, it's interesting. I love the diaries of Virginia Woolf, and so Virginia Woolf had a very fragile mental state, and so she'd never had children, and she was very close to the children of her sister Vanessa. And in her journal, one time she said, "Never pretend to myself that the things that I have don't matter." And I thought that is very profound because that is our instinct, like, which is different from it's sort of different from what you're talking about, being related. Somebody says, I would love to hear more about the hierarchy of pain. So do you want to expand?
Oh, yeah. Well, some people's pain is worth more than others, according to cultural lore. And so, like, the story that just always comes to mind is I was just in the hospital. It was a very sudden diagnosis. I just was pretty much fine one day and then with stage 4 cancer the next. And my older sister was on a plane to come see me. And she was gutted because we all thought I was going to die that year. And she's like trying not to cry on the plane. And a woman says, why are you traveling to North Carolina? And she says, my sister was just admitted to the hospital with stage 4 cancer. And the woman said, yeah, but my parents survived the Armenian genocide. And my sister was like, okay, well, can't they both be bad? Can't they just what world do we have to weaponize?
You're like,
so there's a constant sense that you're supposed to somehow have to pigeonhole your pain in this invisible rung of how it counts and whether other people assign. You hear it constantly in when people die, how old were they? Everyone wants to know. Or if you've had a miscarriage and you lose a child, but how many weeks? Everyone.
Interesting. I never thought about that.
It's just, it's a terrible habit, and it accidentally forces people then to check their reaction to what they think they're allowed to be given, when really there is boundless compassion for all of us. We all have joys, we have sorrows, both count.
Right. Right. So someone says, well, I'm sure you get this question all the time. So what do we say to someone that we just want to give them a little help when they are suffering? What do you think are like, what do you think are kind of the go-to things that you think
Yeah.
are most helpful?
Oh, well, I love the acknowledgement. I just like, I literally can't get enough of the acknowledgement because I can't tell you how rarely I get it. I
So
love it when
what
someone,
form would that take?
they
Like,
just look at me, we just look into each other's beautiful eyes, and they just say, I am so sorry this is happening to you.
that feels inadequate. Do you feel like that is satisfying to hear?
No one says it. I swear to you, no one says it. They don't. Because like, they're like, you can hear it in their voice. They're just like, but I guess they're not. Like everyone's trying to get to the like uptick where they go,
Okay. Can I make a reference that is going to seem inappropriate, but just stay with me, folks, because if you watch The Office obsessively the way I have, there is a moment where Angela's cats have been like kind of euthanized by Dwight, and she's in shock and so sad because she loves her cats. And Michael is having all these her boss is having all these misadventures this day. And so he comes back to the office after having been away. And everybody's like, oh, and something bad happened. And he's like, now what? And Angela says, Sprinkles died. And Michael, like, visibly is like, what? I had no idea. And then he, like, sits down, he puts his hand in his head. He's like, everything. He's like, I can't believe everything. And then Sprinkles dies. And you would feel like Angela is like, thank you. Because everyone is dismissing this for me. And Michael, and he didn't say any words of comfort to her. He just so clearly felt her pain, and like it's like a transcendent moment of the show for me.
That's so good. I really like that. It didn't rush on. It didn't like minimize.
He was just like, this makes this the worst day ever.
It does. It does. It really does. I'm like, all it is in a way, because there's all kinds of words that can be put there, and like, and there's been some great suggestions in the comments about like, I'm so sorry, like my thoughts and prayers are with you. There's all kinds of stuff you can put in that space, but it's kind of like a little space, and you just like, you enter into it where you kind of like, where you let it, they know that you're going to let it land, where you just say, insert acknowledgement words, and then just like take a beat. Okay. And like, so that they know you're not trying to rush, and then you're allowed the off ramp if you want it. Like a lot of people, I always found that sometimes I get tired and I just want to like small talk or, you know, whatever. And so they can say, and then they can go on, or they can just like elaborate. And it's mostly just like an existential openness to like, your pain for this minute is my pain, and I'm sorry this happened.
Okay, so here's something that I do it's very hard for me not to do this, and I think that it's probably not helpful, which is I just want as much information as I can get. Like, I want to ask him, like a friend of mine was diagnosed with cancer, and I was just like, okay, like, I now need to get in this. And I mean, how do you control that? Because in a way you do want to know, and it does come from a place of love, but on the other hand, I feel like it's probably exhausting for the person, and I think it's probably... It's probably for my benefit and not for the benefit of the person who's suffering. So like, how would you think about that desire to understand and know?
Yes. Wow. Well, and you framed it so perfectly. I think all the things you're saying are right. Like, there's a desire to kind of like cross the bridge between us with more information. Yes.
That is exactly the feeling that I have. I feel more connected to you the more I understand your situation.
And then it feels like if I just had more details, then I could live in this world with you.
Yes. Yeah.
The problem is usually pragmatic rather than one of spirit, because the problem is that person's usually told that story 200 million times. It's like if they're walking around with a cast and then they eventually start to make up a different story about how they saved someone in a burning building. Yeah. Because they're like, I can't tell the story one more time. I can't be eclipsed by this story.
Here's a mimeograph sheet.
My problem is not a prop, you know, and they feel like they're carrying it around. And then often, right, that sneaky little thing where they even if it's not true, they're trying to figure out if their pain matches your expectations. Like, you know, well, but it was actually really sad. Like, we end up accidentally being the sufferer, trying to justify, because we really want you to think that our situation is worth loving, worth fixing, worth acknowledging. So we accidentally end up auditioning for the role of someone that needs to be loved, you know, whereas I think you're right, that person is just trying to figure out, like, how can I live in your world with you? So I usually try not to ask any questions. Like, the worse it is, the more I don't ask questions.
Interesting.
Unless the person is frankly died, and then that person's usually looking for an opportunity to like talk about their grief.
Right.
And then I find it sort of opens up a different window, because then they're being offered permission to remember. Some people love to talk about their cancer or their divorce or like whatever's going on. Most people, if they've told the story too many times, are too worried about losing the friendship, so they'll just answer it whether they want to or not.
Well, it's interesting. This is reminding me that this Elizabeth and I we had tried this at home in a previous episode where we talked about, like, if you have a difficult situation, sometimes you should like come up with like a 2 or 3 sentence, like,
Yeah.
Sean and I are getting a divorce, you know, and kind of like, and so that you sort of have a pat answer prepared, and then it kind of is like, and there will be no further questions from the press, you know, whatever. Here, somebody says, when I was diagnosed with cancer, I hated hearing that I was lucky that it wasn't worse. The best thing I heard was just that the person was sorry I was going through this. So that sounds like very much this idea that you don't rank because it could be worse.
Oh yeah.
So you should be grateful.
I was always looking for stage 5 cancer to like compete for the pity of those I wanted love from. It's a weird, pain is a weird world. And the problem is it's just so lonely. Like it's lonely not just for the sufferer, but you know, I'm seeing all kinds of comments from people who are also caring for those whose bodies invite questions. And like,
right. No, someone says, no one asked about my daughter's obvious disabilities or challenges. Well, so that's a great point. Like, is the loving thing to do to say, I mean, how do we approach others with love?
Yeah. That's such that, like, the caregiver person that like you're also loving and trying to shelter. That is a very intense and powerful relationship that like other people's questions kind of like try to insert their way into. And I think that there's so many nuances required with something like that. But so often, some people's bodies invite total silence and dismissal, whereas others just like endless picky curiosity. And it can be really tiring for both versions, that one doesn't get acknowledged, one gets over acknowledged. It's and like the other role that I haven't played is the one of caregiver. I mean, most of the population at some point is going to be a primary caregiver of some kind, and that is a different kind of pain and exhaustion, the one that's done by proxy.
Yeah, there's that beautiful moment in the book where you talk about your husband sort of like has this moment of like he can't take it, and he says like, can we just have a day where we don't talk about cancer? And you were like, I forgot that he's having his own experience, and he's going through something completely different. And that's important.
Yeah, separate planets, really.
Yeah. Somebody says the worst is when someone says, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger.
No, I'm looking for that pill.
Okay.
Yeah, no, it's so bad. It's so bad.
Kate, this is so great. So again, everyone, just tell people like 2 sentences, 3 sentences about your podcast, because I'm sure everybody's going to want to go listen to it. It's so good.
Oh, thanks. It's called Everything Happens, period. And it's to create, it's for when you know you're not going to be the person that lives your best life now, but you still want to find truth and beauty and meaning about how to live inside of finitude. Like, there's lots of things we can change and lots of things we can't. And so trying to live with more generosity and compassion inside the things we can't choose.
Well, you're also just a great interviewer. I mean, aside from the subject, I think you're a fantastic interviewer. So in honor of Kate, the challenge for today is to listen to a podcast that you've been meaning to listen to and that you haven't listened to before. So maybe you already know Kate's podcast, so you can try a different podcast. When we opened this, we started this chat, people started putting in all the podcasts that they were recommending. So if you need a suggestion, there's a bunch earlier in the comments. Somebody did Cautionary Tales, which is a podcast I love. It'd be a great family podcast if you like to listen to things as a family, because it's really, really good like that. Oh, someone says, thank you so much, Kate. I will be reading your book and listening to your podcast. May you be well. Yeah, so listen to a podcast you've never listened to before. And Kate, and tell people about this cool online community thing that you've created for people who feel like they need to come together now during the pandemic.
Oh, sure. So I teach in a divinity school. It's mostly like folks who are going into caregiving professions and ministries and nonprofit work. So we wanted to create a kind of platform so that people who need community around questions of like loneliness and meaning and a little bit more of the spiritual stuff could find like a little bit more community that social media doesn't always provide. So it's called lifetogetherapart.com. And I do like a series of videos, and then there's a platform where people can interact and ask for other readings. And we've got moderators there that are all kind of lovely, trained, interesting people. And it's like the most compassionate series of interactions I have ever witnessed. So it's just a place, like a soft place to ask some questions about what it's like to live inside pandemic world.
Wonderful, wonderful. Well, thanks so much, Kate. It's always such a joy to get to talk to you. I've now spoken to you so many times, and like we've seen each other on screen, and one day we will be face to face.
We will.
I cannot wait. That day will come.
Me
Okay,
too.
bye, everyone.
Thanks so much.
Let's keep our hands clean and our minds clear. See you tomorrow.